And I guess I can go ahead and start introducing us. If you don't know us already, my name is Sarah Lynn Bowman. I'm from the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University, and I'm here with Jason Cox, which I'm very excited about. Jason and I have known each other for many years, and it's been a while since we've been able to connect. So this is exciting. Um, yes, and so let me go ahead and read his bio for you. So Jason Cox is the head of the Multi-Age Visual Arts Education Program at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio. He holds a PhD in Arts Administration, Education, and Policy with a focus in art education from Ohio State University, and his winding past also includes studio experience in a variety of media, puppetry, formal and informal education, analog game design, museum operations, and theater tech. Dr. Cox is the creator of 500-Year-Old Vampire, regularly creates and presents games for use in the classroom, and works with social justice-oriented programs that support accessibility in education. I'm trying to think about when we first met, Jason. Was it it must have been
I
before.
will happily tell this story.
Okay, great.
It was at the very first Living Games conference,
That's
actually.
what I thought. Yeah.
I was, I'd say, about halfway through my dissertation. Not that long before, I had actually stumbled upon functions of role-playing games and posted on social media about how annoyed I was that no one else had told me about it. And then I I referenced your work a lot in my presentation while being unaware that you were, in fact, going to be there sitting in the front row, looking at your own picture in my slide deck. uh, so yeah, that was an experience for me, and also, I mean, quite welcoming. I met an awful lot of really wonderful people through the Living Games conferences, and game scholars are very welcoming, and they come from very many different disciplines. Yeah, I've always found that to be enriching, and I very much treasure our friendship.
Mhm. We've also been wizards together, wizard professors together. So, but who hasn't these days? I mean,
Sorry about my loud laugh.
all right. So if you'd like to share your slides, just a note to say that we are recording this session, as I'm sure you might have heard. And if you have questions throughout the session, please put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom. You can also ask questions on the side, but it's better to have it in the Q&A. So Jason, I will be minding the chat. You don't have to worry about that, and you can just focus on your presentation. And so with that, I will hand it over to Jason.
Thank you so much. Uh, as was said, my name is Dr. Jason Cox. I use he, him pronouns. This is my Playing with for as art, games as arts-based research for pre-service educators. So a lot of my stuff has already been kind of talked about because of Sarah being nice enough to read things there. Um, I suppose it's worth talking a little bit about what I do here. So I'm the head of a licensure program. I teach art teachers, people who've come from various walks of life. I'm up in Northwest Ohio, and being an art teacher was a very important part of my life for a long time before I moved to kind of the meta art teaching. Games is what I do primarily as my research, games as art-based research. We'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit, but I still engage regularly with classroom practice and specifically with visual art within that. Uh, a lot of the things I design are not commercial properties. They're worksheets, they're games for use in the classroom, they're warm-ups. And I pass them out fairly regularly with whoever would be interested. You can always shoot me an email if you'd like some. But I do a couple that are larger ones, and that's a bit more of our focus here. So, arts-based research is something that some people might not have heard of before. Uh, It's, as it says here, Barone and Eisner say it's research meant to enhance perception of human activities and as being defined by the presence of art. That's still pretty broad. It doesn't actually say just visual art. It can be music, it can be theater, it can be anything. In my case, it's games. They also note that arts-based research is more effective at raising questions and problematizing situations often perceived as givens than for providing answers in the way other forms of research might. I often say the arts are good for asking questions. They ask critical questions that might have more than one answer. One of those sometimes is it art? And a curious thing about art is that it can be art for one person and not art for another person, and they can both be correct, which is one reason it doesn't always provide solid answers. The squishiness is the point. But to go back to Eisner for a second, Eisner says words, except when they are used artistically, are proxies for direct experience, whereas works of art enable us to know something about feeling that cannot be revealed in literal scientific statements. So, an example of this that Eisner often used was a glass of water. You can understand a glass of water in a scientific sense. You can talk about the clarity, the makeup of it, the container that it's in. You can measure it. You can describe it in exacting detail down to the molecule. And you will completely miss what it is like to drink that glass of water. In order to understand what it's like to drink the glass of water, you have to get into the subjective. You have to use artistic vocabulary, like it's crisp, it's refreshing. And you can even respond to it through music, through interpretive dance, however you like. I've also put a picture over on the right side there. That's me with my daughter when she was maybe about 2.5, making some art at a public event. And I put this here as another example of this. I could describe the entire process. I could describe how they went about keeping things clean and organized and the things that made the event possible. And those are all valuable things. But it doesn't necessarily encompass me being very worried that my daughter is going to slip because she is wearing plastic booties, that she's going to get that paint all over herself and over me. Uh, it's a new thing for her. This is shortly the pandemic was a very much a part of our lives, and learning how to exist among people and in the world, and at the same time, the the hope and optimism of making art with a small child in public with bright colors as a part of a group, as a celebration. Those are things that are meaningful. They are what the experience is about. They are the whole of the thing, but they are difficult to capture in strictly scientific data. Now, my area, like I said, specifically, I use games for arts-based research. I've listed a couple traits here that I think are things that are specific to that media. It doesn't mean you can't do it in other media. It doesn't mean there isn't another thing that they can do, but these are some that stuck out to me to use them for examination. So Graham Sullivan says, within arts-based research, the data isn't really generated and collected in a solvable way, but in a way where you're trying to surround an experience, to see it from more than one angle, to understand it in a new way. The discourse. So when you're engaging in games, they're kind of a social experience. Not kind of, they are a social experience. And the games mirror things from real life in a way that helps you think again about what you've always assumed to be true, about the things that you say, about the things that you think. They're points of interaction that I don't think I'd say confrontation, but points of critical thought become available to you that aren't there otherwise. You can see on the bottom left, I wrote down focus. enables the creation of social objects. So this is a useful term I find. A social object is a focal point around which players can create, share, and connect to one another. Sometimes these are physical objects, works of visual art, but the game itself can be it. The ephemeral experience of playing the game can be it. It just gives you the point around which things can be developed. Perspectives. They furnish fresh opportunities to see and comprehend tangible expressions of unfamiliar people. So there's another philosopher whose name was Maxine Green, who talked about engaging with works of art in a museum. So when you engage with a work of art in a museum, sometimes it feels like we are all seeing the same thing at the same time, but we're not, because we bring our own personal context with it. It might touch us in a particular way because of something that happened to us or that we saw or an emotion we're feeling or whatever. And what actually makes it most effective is when we begin to have a discussion about it, when we're there having the encounter. Have we seen the work before? Have we seen it in a different context? Have we seen it with these people? All these things will change the discourse, and that changes our perspective. And the unknown. Games, because they are a framework where play is allowed to happen, provide a safe space for taking risks, such as freedom to fail, experiment, fashion identities, and or interpret ideas. Going back over a little bit to the concept of arts-based research. So arts-based research normally falls into three broad categories. You can see Frayling first said into, through, and for. Borgdorf said art is on, for, in. Within the games, I'm using terms with, for, and as art to recognize the agency the arts have as social objects, which was on my previous slide. I've separated them out like this, and there's more than one way to talk about them. So, research with art, a reflective interpretation that does not involve direct creation or manipulation of an artistic encounter. And then in parentheses, I put aesthetics. This is me kind of drawing on some Western philosophy here. So, aesthetics is largely reflective. That may feel counterintuitive at first. You're like, what's my aesthetic? I'm coming in with an aesthetic. This is really more about an aesthetic experience. It's about the making of meaning after something has already passed. It's trying to connect the dots within your mind. An example of this that I provide is a lovely article called Beyond the Rules of the Game. Why are Rui rules nice? In that, looking at a playground game, in the United States, we call it Foursquare. It's a relatively simple game, but it's got rules that can be adjusted while you're playing. Rui rules were very generalized, but they were nice. They were be kind. You're playing to enjoy playing. So if a fourth grader has a first grader join the game, they don't immediately try to get them out. They want to have an enjoyable game for everyone. But there are ways that could be challenged. There's ways that system falls apart. If someone wants hard and fast and always applicable rules, regardless of who's playing, the Rui rules can be harder to articulate. And that's a big part of what that article is about, is the observations from outside of the game that the researcher had. Research for art, an examination of arts practices, typically aiming to make some concrete alteration to the process of creation. Praxis. So praxis is how we plan to do things. It is our practice, but it's also everything that we're doing in advance, our understandings that we're going into things with. As an example, I'm pointing at Critical Play, which I imagine a lot of people have read that are watching this, by Mary Flanagan, which draws on art history to introduce game design techniques that subvert tropes and encourage social justice. So Flanagan writes about games that challenge a lot of assumptions and get you to think about history in a different way, make you more aware of historical figures that have perhaps been passed by, and suggest ways that other game designers could incorporate her techniques. Um, you could also, if you were thinking about this in more traditional visual art terms, think about this in terms of experimenting with new media, experimenting with computers, or I'm not a particular fan of artificial intelligence programs, but that would be an example of this as well. Lastly, research as art. Use the arts as generative tools for reflection and expression. And I've got a term there that a lot of people probably don't know, which is poiesis. This is being in the moment. This is the thing that is gone as soon as you are experiencing it. It is ephemeral, but it is meaningful. It is the lived experience. And as an example of that, I put a wonderful article called "The Battle of Primrose Park: Playing for Emancipatory Bleed in Fortune and Felicity" by Janaea Kemper. Describes a process of creation and curation of artifacts before, during, and after in-character experiences. So in this, Kemper is talking both about things that they made, like playlists for a character, the costumes, things like that, things that were given to her during the game, such as notes or artifacts people made just to give to the character. And then, reflective things that occurred afterwards, stories that tried to put things that had been unresolved during the game to bed. And these various artifacts have an effect on the person and that made them, but also the people that are connected to them, hence the emancipatory bleed. The magic circle within that context is very, very permeable because the artifacts are having an extra diegetic effect and are sometimes also drawn from spaces outside of the game. I think I've got that pretty broadly there. Let's go on to here. So these three games here, whoops, back. I either wrote or co-wrote these games. So these are all mine. I use them in my practice as an arts educator. But a lot of my students have never played the kind of games that I often enjoy. They haven't played a story game. They haven't played a role-playing game. They're not terribly familiar with them. So there's a lot of things that need to be moderated in order to make games and games as arts-based research accessible. And one thing that I do is I actually build on this over a period of years. So there's a introductory game in the form of What to Do About Michael. There's Mantles in the Museum, kind of in the middle, and 500-year-old Vampire is more of a capstone. So What to Do About Michael. So this was actually the game that I created while I was still working on my PhD that I presented about to that first meeting with Sarah. And it was a very different period in my life when I was making this. There was a combination of things happening. I did actually have to present on something for a history of education course. And I was looking at the deconstructivists, but then Foucault particularly rose to the top. And at the same time, I lost a family member to self-harm. And while I was at their wake, I was hearing all these stories about the differences that they had made and about how important they were and about all the good times. And I just wished there was a way they could have known. And I started thinking about the way that we impact each other, the way we can't see these effects we have, that the effect of one person and they affect infinite amount of other people. And I started thinking about how to make that clearer. And I was also thinking about Foucault, who would talk about power in a way that you could read it and say, yes, I've seen that. I've seen it so many times in various other people. I'm so glad that I'm aware, but I'm not part of that. I'm not part of the systems that he sees. Those are other people that are trapped. So I created What to Do About Michael initially to illustrate some of Foucault's theories, and also provide a context in which you could see the strings being pulled, where you could see the authority. And it eventually expanded out from that. The basic game is fairly limited to a meeting, but as my dissertation, we developed all the other characters around it. We developed Michael, we developed Michael's family, we developed the principal, we developed the other students that were within it, and we experimented with a lot of different techniques. But it works either way. It just has a slightly different effect. So to talk through what I have on the slide a little, freeform parlor LARP. It's pretty rules light. It just uses mostly American freeform rules. Parlor because it's pretty much always self-contained within the room that you're in. It's partially so that people feel more safe to take the chances that the game entails. It is, as I said, a simulated faculty meeting. I go a little bit more into that underneath there. And normally we play it in a single session near the end of the introductory course. I've also done this at some conventions. I do find that the game has slightly more effect the more you do it because it encourages more and more reflection and a more complicated conception of how power works. But it works fairly well as a single session as well. So Michael is actually a variation on Michel Foucault. I did some research into his biography and based the character that's in the game off of him. He was, as Michael is, a talented and witty student who attended prestigious schools. He had professional parents, but there were things that made him a difficult student. Amongst them being that he did, in fact, attack another student, as is the story here. And when that happens, the staff has to meet to decide what to do about it. The parents are involved, there's stakeholders, the kids are involved, there's questions of safety, there's questions of what the rules are, what is the best thing to be done? And would it make more sense to try to pass it off to someone else? Does it go to a social worker? If it does, who? What is your responsibility? What is your liability? And there's a couple of effects that this has. Now, before I had separated out arts-based research into 3 different areas: the with, the for, and the as. Most of the time, when you're doing arts-based research, you're not trying to do more than one of those. My argument here is that this game and the other games that I'm talking about provide an opportunity to do all 3 in different ways. They don't necessarily do them equally. They don't necessarily have the same effect for every student, but they open up areas of inquiry. With art, again, largely reflective. This is a simulation of a common faculty experience that is underexplored in teacher education programs. We spend about, I'd say 99% of the time talking about your classroom, about how you write your unit plans, how you organize your supplies, how you'll work with the students, how you motivate them, how you assess them. And that is great. That's 80% of teaching. But a lot of times that other 20% gets not as much attention. What's it like to be a member of faculty? How do you deal with the fact that you might have a faculty member you do not like? How can you work together? What do you do when there's a student that has a problem? Who do you go for advice? So these end up being questions that I was uncomfortable just throwing students into the pool without them having thought about them before going in. For art. So this is, again, your practice. Players respond in visual media to the embodied fiction that they experienced. Longer games introduce numerous freeform LARP techniques. So I have another slide about this right after this one. So I'm going to go there and then I'll come back. These are reflective artworks. These ones are actually from my dissertation, but I do use reflective artworks fairly regularly. And you can see the blue skull and the eyeball. Those are from someone who actually played the character Michael in my dissertation. And they were made to be from his perspective. That's Michael's Facebook page. That's Michael's skull. Whereas sometimes they're more abstract, such as being a missing piece or the complex relationship between parents and children, or the way someone can feel isolated and still want to touch the world around them. And the lived experience is a thing that certainly players can talk about, but having a chance to work it out artistically as well sometimes provides additional insight. And lastly, on the as art, this is again your lived experience. So it's the lived experience of illustrating Foucauldian understanding of authority in schools and critical questions of best practices. And again, one of the reasons this is valuable to me is it's not just because of the simulation. It's not just skill training. It's not just this is how you do it. It's also this is how it feels. And how could we do it differently? If we are sometimes trapped by authority, how can we challenge that? How can we evade it? Is the way that we're enforcing the rules in the service of the students in the school, or is it just in service of the rules? And asking those critical questions, I think, is important because I want my students, when they are teachers, to keep asking those questions. We'll move forward to Mantles in the Museum here. This is a game I co-created with my good friend, Dr. Lillian Lewis, who is now at Virginia Commonwealth University. So Lillian has a different background than I do. She started as a museum educator, first and foremost in Texas. And I come into things with a fairly broad base, but also my focus in games. And we decided that we wanted to work together to combine those things. And at first, I had said, well, we could talk about the different games that are used for the to enhance a museum's collection. And we could talk about it in abstract. We could talk about the theory. And my good friend said, I am so sick of talking about theory. I am so tired of that. I want to make a game that does something. I want to make a game that changes things. So we did. Mantles is a freeform pervasive larp. It's pervasive in the sense that it is actually played within a gallery space, a museum. I've done it before where I set up artwork around a room. It really does work best in a museum. It works okay in a room just with the art laid out. Normally, when I run it, I have the advantage. The University of Toledo, it has a very, very great relationship with the Toledo Museum of Art. So I can get in there after hours. Yeah, haha. There's no reason you can't play it in a museum live. We have done that. We've done that at the Columbus Museum of Art. It's been played internationally. But having the museum space available changes the nature of the game in a couple of ways that we'll touch on in a bit. The general idea here is that the players are curating an international exhibition. And if you're doing it during a class, there's some homework that works, intersects with the immersive experience. And I normally do this during a curriculum design course. So I take the students into the museum. So description of the game on the left, museum stakeholders with different frameworks for understanding and valuing art select 3 works from the galleries for an upcoming international biennial. We actually normally format this as being UNESCO from the UN, which is, if you are aware, the United States has not and does not actually financially support UNESCO because its whole point is a cultural exchange to try and create understanding between different peoples. And the United States does not fund things with countries it's in conflict with. And UNESCO kind of operates the opposite of that. The goal of the game isn't to change someone's framework, but rather to look for the productive discourse that emerges where frameworks intersect. I'm going to go forward a little bit here. So you can see, I'll come back to these in a moment, but on the right-hand side over there, you can see one of the character cards. We wear these as badges. You can just pick them up, put them on. You can see I'm wearing one. That's Lillian on the top wearing one. And on the front, it's got the name of the character and then a broad description of who they are. And on the bottom, you can see the different frameworks that we're using for this: expressionist, instrumentalist, formalist, institutionalist, imitationalist. Each one of them have different ideas about what art is for, what makes it best, what makes it valuable. These are not the only 5 frameworks, though. Lillian and I are actually working on a new game right now that explores a lot of oppressed, hidden, devalued perspectives that we wanted to make sure got attention, that had their chance to shine here. With art. So this introduces the players to the 5 different frameworks for understanding and critiquing works of art. The experience of students is often that they don't feel comfortable at first saying anything about art. This will come up again in a moment. And part of that is not necessarily feeling like they have access to the truth, to what is accurate. The frameworks say things like art needs to look like the thing it represents. That's imitationalist. It needs to feel authentic. It needs to feel real. Art needs to represent some kind of emotive idea, like expressionist. Art is composed of lines and shapes and colors that can be arranged for a pleasing composition. That might be formalist. So going through this, you begin to understand how the arts are seen in a broader context. It is a strictly academic approach that within the reflective component lets you begin to understand the differentiation of aesthetics. For art, players select a character that uses a critical framework that differs from their own and use light costuming to signify that difference. So part of the homework is to read through the frameworks and pick the one that is closest to your own. The characters, there's actually 3 for each framework. And one of the things about that is they don't actually, any of them, engage with their framework in the same way. There's multiple types of formalists, expressionists, imitationalists, what have you. So looking at that, finding someone who differs from you significantly. It's not really a binary, so it can't be an opposite, but someone who has a different view. And in the homework, what you do is you pick a work of art and you try to critique it both from your own view and from this character's view, and look for the points where they converge or differ. If I go forward again, you can see in my picture, my character is not dressed in the same way that I typically do. And Lillian's lovely snarl there is my favorite picture. And within the picture on the right, you can see that the students have modified their clothing slightly with a hat or a lab coat or what have you. And it doesn't need to be a big costume, but adding any costume element helps add to the alibi. It helps people feel comfortable being different. It helps them feel like they have authority, hence the mantle, while they're within the museum. And that difference is part of what makes the game accessible as art. So here we are into the lived experience again. Challenges institutional assumptions on whose voices matter in discussions about art and its value. One of the effects of going into the museum here and saying something is or is not valuable, should be preserved or should not, should be seen internationally, is the realization that even though objects are presented along with a placard that says, Here is the truth. Here is what you need to know about this object. That these things that are presented as objective and absolute truth still actually represent a particular perspective, a particular point of view. This is the institutionalist framework, the idea that the people who've done the research, who collect the stuff, who work in the field, that they have a lock on what is valuable. And as somebody with a PhD in this, I can't deny I got a little bit of institutionalist in me. But at the same time, I would love to be challenged. I like it when students point out things I don't know or tell me that I'm wrong. I like that discourse. But the assumption when you're encountering a museum is that it's absolute up until you put on a little bit of a costume, do a little bit of research, and alter your identity a little bit and ask, what if it's not? What if something isn't valuable just because someone says it is? What if something's more valuable than everyone seems to think, even though it's off here on the side? And once you've begun to challenge those assumptions within the game, it becomes easier to challenge those assumptions outside of the game as well. Let's go back over this for a moment. When I made these characters, I very cleverly decided that the last name would always be different languages, words for the color blue. I'm not particularly good with languages. I used a whole lot of various web resources to find different words for the different colors. But it was my way of avoiding kind of stereotypical names and not getting trapped with assumptions that I might otherwise have made. This is my game 500-Year-Old Vampire that I adapted from 1,000-Year-Old Vampire by Tim Hutching. So Tim actually played Mantles in the museum. And Tim has a master's in art. And he said, I don't think I've ever heard of these frameworks before. And the thing about the frameworks is that you're more likely to encounter them in museum studies than in studio studies, which to my mind is a different kind of problematic. But he enjoyed it. He thought a lot about it. And when people asked him to do an educational adaptation of 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, he decided that he would feel more comfortable if I was working on it, since I had a background in education, and he asked me to do so. And while I was working on it, the Central Michigan University contacted us about publishing. And so that is that we were published through them. And Tim's original game is a solo journaling game. If you've never played it, I do suggest it. It's a lovely game. Uh, it's good, lonely fun. And in Tim's game, you just need the book itself and some dice, and you move back and forth through the book and maintain a journal. And a lot of it's about the loss of memory and the loss of meaning and the complex changes that we go through in our life. When I began to adapt 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, I ran into a couple of things. One was that because I wanted to be in a classroom environment, doing something that was isolating, where you were just by yourself, wasn't very effective. So it had to become a group game, which changed what the game's about. You change the context, you change the meaning. Another thing about it was that I found most people who play 1,000-Year-Old Vampire tend to draw on their assumptions about vampires and about history. You don't normally do a whole lot of research. And I wanted to encourage more diverse perspectives, to look at legends from different cultures, to look at history from around the world. And so I began to change that as well. And with my very first group, I said, okay, I would like you to start on a continent. I've listed all the continents. What continent would you like to start on? And they said Australia. And I said, all right, let's see what was happening in Australia 1,000 years ago. And there was a speed bump because colonialists are very effective at destroying history they don't want other people to know about. The indigenous people of Australia have probably a fairly good understanding of what it was like 1,000 years ago. They are disinclined to share that information, and I do not blame them. But for the most part, the accessible information about Australia actually begins around the 17th century, in the mid 1600s. And that is largely a function of the destruction of culture, the destruction of ideas, the destruction of narrative that was vid upon that continent. So I could either have us make up things for about a 500 to 600 year old span, or I could shorten it. So I shortened it to 500-year-old vampire, in part because of those effects upon the world, to give us access to history that we might be able to engage with. And even then, if students are playing in certain environments, what's accessible is going to vary widely. If they're playing a character that's in Holland in the 17th century, there's lots of information. It gets a little bit more difficult when you're looking at, say, the Inuit people, or if you move to Mexico. And so it becomes a little bit more complex within that. Another thing that I wanted to do was to incorporate the arts. And I find a lot of time when people are playing this game, they're very much okay with the writing part, but the arts make them nervous. Kind of like with the museum, they feel like they often tell me I'm the worst ever. I can't even draw a straight line. I'm terrible at art. That's not my art. My art's the writing. My art's the role play. And feeling safe enough to take risks with the art is part of what the game's about. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 rounds. I often use accessible media. I use the things that are available to us in grade school. I use glue sticks and markers and construction paper. I use brass fasteners. And I encourage them to use them in whatever way they want. It doesn't have to be the way you've seen them used. I'll come back to some of those in a moment. Let's run through what I've got here. Keepsake and journaling game. So the term keepsake game means that you're making artifacts that ideally you would want to keep. When I run this at conventions, most of the keepsakes are very contextually specific. They're only valuable within the game itself. They aren't really designed to last, but within the game, they can hold a lot of meaning. If it's outside of a convention, if you're playing where you have an extended amount of time, then you're more likely to make something that might last a while. The journaling part is actually slightly different for this game than it is within 1,000-year-old vampire, because in 1,000-year-old vampire, you are always writing to yourself. And within 500-year-old vampire, you are in fact always writing to other members of your cohort. The next line there says, follows cohorts of vampires over the course of their long existences. So these are the people who knew you when you were human. You all kind of knew yourselves, you knew each other, and then some horrible creature came and turned you all into vampires. They're the only creatures who remember what it was like, who remember the things you remember. And even then, as time passes by, they might not remember it, or you might remember things differently. There comes a point where they're pretty far diverged. So where 1,000-year-old vampire was largely about the individual loss of memory, this is kind of about the push-pull of people that you know for an extended period, sometimes frenemies. Played through a course on educational innovations. It's literally, the course is called Innovations in Art Education. I do this over the course of the whole semester, where What to Do About Michael was a solo session in one room. where the Mantles in the Museum is a pervasive game, but it's the homework and then the lived experience. 500-year-old vampire extends throughout the course of the semester. And then at the end, you do a gallery exhibit at the end of significant artifacts to tell your vampire story. Uh, a cohort of vampires try to hold on to a semblance of who they once were by exchanging letters and artifacts that reflect on the events that transpire as they just pass. Players use random prompts and light historical research to inspire their work, which they share with their peers. Adapted from Thousand-Year-Old Vampire by Tim Hutchings. Uh, fun, funny story. Tim originally didn't really want his name on things because he didn't want to take away from it, from what I was doing. And then as a consequence, when it went live on BackerKit, a lot of people accused me of trying to steal Tim's game. But I recognize it came from a place of love. But also I was like, no, I would never do that. I'm going to go forward a slide here, I think. So over on the right-hand side there, you can see the game and some of the cards that are within it. On the bottom are some collages that Tim actually made. Those are inspirational collages. And then you can see I've got stacks of cards that tie to different ages that I used for the vampires. When they're first reborn, when they're neophytes, when they're elders, when they're ancients, and then there's a conclusion card, which typically describes a fairly sticky ending. And each one of these has a game effect and a narrative suggestion, as well as some critical questions for people to think about when they're writing their letters to each other and about what kind of works they will do. While they're doing this, every time the time changes, all the members of the cohort have to find a historical fact or an image or a legend or something about the time and place that they are in to provide a context for understanding the different experiences their vampires are having. Oops, wrong way. So to go back into my with art, so reflective, researching the times and places characters move through challenges ethnocentric assumptions. Mojave actually talks about this some with the red lines when you go to Wikipedia. Sometimes there's things that are referred to that there's no more developed article, there's no more information available online. We have this assumption sometimes that all the knowledge of human history is available at your fingertips online. But this is in fact not true. That is an unfortunate assumption in the long run. There's tunnels. It's not flying, it's tunneling. Things will link to other things, but those pathways are actually already dug, even if we can't see them. And they can be limiting. And a lot of the time, they just recreate the same assumptions over and over again. So being aware of that is when you can't find more information, when you have to dig more, when you have to look at something from multiple perspectives. And doing a little bit of the historical research, even light historical research, makes a difference in being aware of those assumptions in the first place. For art, the prompts and rule set support artistic experimentation in a wide variety of media. So the rules actually say you're not allowed to use any media more than 2 times. And sometimes there's people who worry about that. So if you did a pencil drawing twice, you have to switch to something else. Could be ink, could be sculpture, but it's meant to encourage people to push themselves. Some of my favorite works I've had that are not on the next page. One person got a card that said they had forgotten their mother, and they did a fantastic charcoal portrait and then hit it hard with an eraser across the face, left a big smear, and honestly brought me to tears. As someone who dearly misses his own mother, it was tough and effective. Another student had tried to make a teapot out of paper mache, but it didn't work. So what they did instead was they took out all of the tea leaves from various bags of tea and pushed them into the shape of a teapot. I had somebody who was one of the people who told me they were not good at art, swore they were terrible at art, struggled with the concept that they would have to make art. Their character had an insect collection. So they took a piece of foam core and they pushed the brass clips up underneath it and then spread out the top. So it looked like a whole bunch of little brass insects that were pinned to a board. One of my favorite pieces. I do not think the person believed me about that, but highly effective. So the limitations of the game, as well as the prompts, end up pushing people to be creative, to think differently, to see things differently, to understand the affordances of things. A pencil doesn't just have to be something that you write with. You can roll with it, you can erase with it, you could break it, you could do pierce things with it. You start to see the materials differently when those restrictions push you to do so. As art, repeated exchanges develop a polyphonic narrative that exists as a duality with players' individual experiences. Breaking out my $5 words, as my brother would say. Um, Polyphonic means that you're hearing more than one story. And the duality here is that you've got both the individual experience that a player has of their vampire, but also the more complex cohort story that exists as they write to each other, talk to each other, as their relationships change, as the people they have in common have different encounters in their life. If the people they have in common continue to live or become vampires themselves or are remembered fondly. And so you end up with a more complex experience as a whole. To talk through this a little bit here, these are from various different times in vampire lives. These are all student works. You can see up on the top left, the student actually made a newspaper clipping that was referring to events with their character. Another one's a wallpaper, and then uh, I think they made the dress, and they used one of the dolls that they actually had from when they were little. The collage portrait, and then the portrayal of Australia there, which was actually tied to the Prime Minister of Australia who went missing in the late 20th century. And the vampire actually claimed that they had consumed that prime minister. So I'm into my conclusion. Games as a media for arts-based research present opportunities that extend to more than training through simulation or motivation through enjoyment. They can invite students to keep asking questions about their discipline, to think critically about their practices and their impact, and to draw on their creativity to address challenges we have not even imagined. They do this not by thinking of those challenges as problems to be solved, but as experiences to be surrounded with, for, as art. And that's what I got. Thank you so much.
Awesome, Jason. Thank you so much for this. I think I can probably speak for many people here when I say that we wish that you were here to read bedtime stories every night because you have such a soothing voice and such incredible depth in what you're sharing here. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
So we do have some questions, and I have some as well. Folks, if you still have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. We're going to talk for another 35 minutes or so, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
So the first question is, how do you merge the ephemerality of art and play with the rigidity of research and academia?
Well, the perception of rigidity is something academia encourages, frankly. There's places where you can bring it in. My my research is largely qualitative, but you can actually do quantitative with this as well. But most of the time, we're collecting experiences, collecting multiple perspectives. Sometimes it's I'm gonna use terms, and then if I need to qualify them, I'm sure you'll tell me to. Autoethnographic. So Kemper's work is largely autoethnographic, where she is using herself as kind of the primary subject. Uh, but in my dissertation, it was actually much broader. I was working with pre-service and teachers who were actually in schools, and then the questions end up being about how perceptions changed, how things related to their lived experiences, what effects the game had on them. So, as an example of that, um, one of the things that we did during my dissertation, one of the students was both playing Michael's older sister, Haley, and the student that Michael who had attacked, who we decided was kind of Michael's bully, who was named James within our game. And Haley only really existed because at one point during the faculty meeting, someone asked about his older sister. And so it said, Haley's great. I'm not worried about Haley. And from that point, Haley was perfect and therefore got no attention from her parents. And the reflection about what it meant to play that character for the person playing it affected how they thought about their students and how they thought about themselves. Because they also played the bully character, their original version of that was based on someone that they knew who had bullied them. I started smiling because I was thinking about functions of role playing games while I was saying it. Uh, but but one of their realizations was that this person was never going to seek them out and give them closure. They were never going to get that. They were off having another life. And then also to think about what this meant for their students and in process. Now, when I say research, I am for myself normally talking within a higher education context, publish or perish. We want to get out there. We want to get to do cool presentations with people online. But not all research actually occupies in that space. Sometimes you have what we call teacher research, or in this case, I would say student teacher research. My students are engaging with these games not as formal research, but still, I would say as research. The games go by; they are ephemeral, they don't last, but the effects that they have do. And one of the reasons I refer to them as research and not instruction is because the possibilities of the game are variable. They're dependent upon the students that are involved, the context that's involved. Life events will change how we perceive things. I just recently played What to Do About Michael again, and the current state of education in the United States makes that game play very differently than it did when I wrote it 10 years ago. So the ephemerality, I would say, actually makes it more versatile. It makes it more adaptable than some other forms of research might be. It does, at the same time, make it harder to get taken seriously by people who believe that you need large amounts of quantitative data in order to approach what they think of as truth.
We definitely feel that pressure at the TPI as well. um, I have some sort of follow-up questions based on what you said. One of them is around the institution aspect, because you mentioned that you are part of the institution, but we've also talked about how it can feel pretty alienating doing LARP research within the institution. So how does like LARP and art and the institutional value interrelate, like in your experience?
It's slightly inconsistent. Um, so there's a number of various fine artists who have done something that we might perceive as a solo pervasive LARP. over the years. It's not always considered to be particularly accessible. And then you get Alan Caprow, I know, comes up a lot also as an artist who created these happenings that people would engage with. If you've ever seen Blue Man Group or engaged with anything that put together by Meow Wolf, they also kind of skirt the spaces that we often deal with in games and LARP especially. The general response I get from people, especially from people who have engaged with one of my games, is that it's super cool and they want to do more of it. How many people actually do more of it, I don't know, but a few people do. My game, 500-Year-Old Vampire, sold fairly well, and a lot of people bought the curriculum guide along with it. So, in theory, a bunch of teachers are using it. I hope so. Uh, but then it gets a little bit more complex, as you say, within the institution itself. So, Mantles in the museum, we originally thought a museum might want to purchase it, run it, use it. However, in American museums, they only really want to run games that they develop themselves for their own collections. General use games are of no interest to American museums. They want to advertise their own collections, so they don't have a use for my game. Part of that is also that they're not necessarily looking for growth. They want attendance, they want to have impact. Museums can't actually measure for growth. They don't have a way to do it. So that's not actually their focus, unlike K to 12 games. So it becomes a little bit trickier there in terms of getting the word out, getting the players, getting them into those things, making the value accessible. And then in turn, if the game's not accessible, then the knowledge isn't accessible, and then that kind of misses the point. And my co-author and I actually ran into a similar problem within art education. Where do you publish something like that? With the magazines, the American publications largely did not want to because it was, quote, not what they did. What we were able to do actually was to come at it by talking specifically about its effects as a disruptive influence and to publish an article that way. But publishing the game itself was not something that we were able to do that way. We're looking at other ways of doing it. Analog Game Studies has had some interest in doing that. They're doing some work with the idea of being punk right now, which I am in full support of. And so to exist and challenge the institution while being within inside the institution is difficult to get the attention while you're in fields that are minimized. Art education, it does not get a particularly large amount of attentions or funds within a university context, and games within the art education, I would say, is significantly more niche. But when people engage with it, they tend to be quite taken with it. And what can I say? I'm stubborn. So the way that I do it is through persistence and through the knowledge that when people play it, they engage with it and want more of it. And also, at the end of the day, I will at least have played some lovely games with some incredible people.
Definitely hear you on that persistence. So there, we have quite a few questions. One is a very logistical one. So how long do these games take from the first time you get the idea to the final version being played? So I guess but I'm not sure if this is about the production of the game itself or the players playing the game, because it says, especially for 500-Year-Old Vampires, since it seems there were more pieces to produce.
Sure. I can talk about both things. Let's talk about the actual playing of the game first. So what to do about Michael? Like I said, you can play in a single session. I kind of want to update it because it's been a moment, and some of my assumptions 10 years ago are not the same now, but it takes maybe a half hour. The characters are very thin. They are paper thin characters, and that's on purpose. There's not a lot to them, although when you play the game longer, they become more developed. Um, the mantles in the museum characters are largely contained within those cards. So they are described fairly simply. You put on the costume. They are again kept paper thin. And part of the reason for this is to make them accessible to people who don't play these games very often. They don't have to memorize very much. They have almost everything they need. They tend to be more adaptable. You need slightly more workshopping with mantles in the museum, though, because especially if you're playing during an actual day, you have to consider some of the calibration mechanics. I have had many students who would not have been able to play if I did not tell them that they did not have to play. They have to be given the option not to play. So, to talk about game studies for a moment, one of the things about games is that they require voluntary participation. If it's not voluntary, it's not a game. If it's not voluntary, it's a chore. And chores do not share the same possibility for transformation and influence that games have. And I've encountered people who say if people agree to be in the class, they've given consent, but that is hogwash. And the reason it is hogwash is because consent can be withdrawn. And if they're in my class, there are definite downsides to deciding to withdraw unless I make it so that they can do so. Uh, However, I can certainly mediate how they're able to be involved. I can offer other opportunities. I could let them just write a paper. I could let them engage with it strictly as a character in a written format, and that's a possibility as well. Uh, but I need to be adaptable to the needs of the players there. It doesn't happen too often, but it does sometimes happen. So a little bit more work with calibration. That one also requires the homework. That being said, the game itself doesn't take that long. It's really only about an hour. I say game in itself. The whole thing is the game, but the immersive portion is about an hour. So you do 15 to 20 minutes for the workshopping at the end, about an hour immersive play, about 10 minutes of debrief at the end of that one. 500-year-old vampire varies a little bit. The fastest I've ever done it was 1 hour, and I don't like that. And that really only gives you time for one round. And that's the reason I don't like it. Because, like I said, people start to be willing to push themselves to experiment more as the game goes on. They also develop more complex relationships with each other as the game goes on. There's two side effects though. So one, like I said, I normally do it in my class over a period of 10 weeks. There's 10 sessions if you play a 500-year-old vampire from beginning to end. The range of years that covers tends to be from around 350 to roughly 500. And because you roll the years randomly. Um, and in my class, the the reflection takes a little bit of time because people have the share out period where they're sharing what they made, where they get the spotlight, where they can read their story. And that's actually very important. It's one of the things I learned while I was writing what to do about Michael is that if you have several sessions in a row, having the share the artifacts at the beginning is important because as much as I love community and collaboration, sometimes people just want a little bit of that shine for themselves and it matters to have it there. So having it at the beginning is useful. And then they prepare for the next creation and then they move into the studio again. So in my class, like I said, I'm giving half hour to 45 minutes most of the time. The setup tends to take longer because they don't know how to play yet, because they don't have any expectations yet. Even people who've played narrative and story games, my game's fairly different, even from 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. So getting into a place where you're setting those expectations and understanding what you're in for takes a little bit of time. But once it's running, it tends to go pretty smoothly. So if I'm running it at a convention and I have 3 hours instead of one, while that first round will go pretty slowly, by the third round, it actually goes pretty quickly. And people are ready to share things out a lot faster and to have things they're more excited to experiment with the art materials. They're more excited to see where the narrative goes. Um, a side effect as a teacher. To go back to Alan Caprow, he talked about a similar thing. 500-year-old vampire scales from between 3 to 30 people. The more people who are playing, the less I, as the teacher, can keep track of everybody's narratives. I read about them afterwards. I do have to give them grades, um, but I'm not a part of those conversations anymore if there's more than one cohort. So cohorts are limited to 3 to 5 people. So the second we hit 6 people, I am not actually part of the conversation. And that is a real bummer for me because I know they're all having a great time. They're making great work. They're having great conversations. These emergent narratives are springing up all over the room. And it's like being in a wonderful garden that I cannot smell any of the flowers. Um, and Alan Caprow talked about that with some of his happenings, where he would write things and people would do them, but he wasn't there. He didn't experience it. It certainly has value. It's great, but uh, yeah. Um, in terms of writing them, a little all over the place. I've written a lot of short games for Golden Cobra. I strongly recommend people do because it's a good way to get in practice, and all the games that are there are free, so you can always try them out. Uh, but the original What to Do About Michael, the very first iteration of it, took me, I think, 2 weeks because I was very focused on it. And as I mentioned, I had a lot of things going in my life that were powering it. 500-year-old vampire took me a real long time, even though I was working on someone else's framework, in part because we had this darn pandemic in the middle, uh, in part because I needed the students to be able to play test it, um, in part because I'm a full-time professor. Um, and Mantles in the museum, I was working on at a distance with a friend, largely online. We ran through several iterations. I think the basic framework of the game took us 2 semesters. Again, because teachers. And also you need to get the game into people's hands in order for you to see whether or not your idea about what they're going to get out of it is what they're getting out of it, or whether you're just getting very confused players.
You actually hit on a number of these questions. There were questions about recommendations to get them up and running and facilitate smooth gameplay. It sounds like time is one of those recommendations. And then also the ratio of teachers to students, which can be tricky when you're the only teacher, and how many students can engage in each one. So um, do you have any recommendations for scholars interested in doing arts-based research on how to get started or ways to get this sort of work supported by one's institution?
Well, one thing that I would say to get started is to play the games. Everything is perfect in your head. You got to get in there. You got to play the games. I was lucky enough to attend a Nordic LARP sampler early on when I began researching. That made a big difference for me. Uh, it also puts you in contact with people. So if you go to the conferences where these games are played, you make the connections. The connections give you a peer group to give you feedback on your games. And as I mentioned earlier, in my own experience, the Living Games Conference in particular, but also various people I met through Origins who are also academics, um, they're very welcoming. They're excited to talk about games. We got into this because we want to talk about games. It is not hard to make us talk about games. So don't feel shy about doing it. We're excited. We want to see it. So going and playing the games gives you a context for creation, and gives you the context that you need to establish a peer group. Artist collectives are a thing. Writers' rooms are things. Literally, the 500-year-old vampire creates an artist collective. I call it a cohort, but that's what it is. Uh, so those are all valuable things. Getting an institution to support this can be harder. I have asked that same question. Um, the the problem if you're within higher education is that a lot of the money is held off for very large grants, which is never what we're going to be dealing with. So we're looking more at smaller publications. One way to get those out is things like Golden Cobra, um, and also sharing with the various contacts that you make. There's organizations like Games on Demand or LARP House or the Make a Scene Festival would actually be someone I would recommend, something I'd recommend for people that are working in LARP as well. Uh, but the more you do it, the more people you will find, and the more connections, the more opportunities you'll find. And that's a big part of it. The secret of doing it, frankly, is to do it. To make it profitable can be a little bit more of a challenge. To draw in the grant dollars can be tricky. Arts grants are available. Typically, there are both state and sometimes city, as well as federal grants. I would not expect federal grants currently to be particularly accessible, but they are out there. I have largely functioned without the grants because I am more or less alone within my program. I've got to administrate, teach, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have time for also doing the grant writing, but I have been fortunate to be supported by a number of fantastic people, and I have no complaints about any of the artists, writers, or producers that I've worked with. Like my experience with 500-year-old vampire with Central Michigan University was really was quite exceptional, and they they asked me for who I would recommend for an artist, and Jabari Weathers did our art. I love all of it. Jabari acted as our art director, got other diverse artists onto the game. It's all fantastic. It's all perfect. Uh, and the reason I'm saying that out loud is that part of who you want to work with, who you trust, who you can be with. And there's a lot of word of mouth. So you also want to be that person who is trustworthy.
Please. I'm having a little bit of lag. Sorry about that. Um,
Okay.
I'm gonna choose the ones that are more about transformation because that's what we study here. So I would love to open that up a little bit. Um, let's see here. Have you had, and can you tell us about experiences where students found out more about themselves or their own family history through the game?
Sure. I would say that I've seen of that in 500-year-old vampire, which doesn't mean it isn't, it means that they're not necessarily telling me. However, uh, where the other two games paper thin characters, the 500-year-old vampire characters, normally I suggest people use my pre-generated characters. 1,000-year-old vampire has an extensive character creation problem. I say problem. It's not really a problem. Process. Sorry, didn't mean problem. Process. Uh, which was a problem when I moved it into my classroom because it was something that was unfamiliar to the students and became a barrier. So I normally use the pre-generated characters, and I would suggest most people do use the pre-gens, and then if you play it a second time, make your own character. Uh, but a side effect of that is that they are very happy to tell very sad stories about those characters because they are so distant from them. They will tell heartbreaking stories of these vampires' existences, of the loss they experience, and of the questionable decisions that these monsters make uh, because they're so different. In what to do about Michael, like I said, there tends to be a lot more connection. because you recognize things that happen to you in school, things that you're worried about in school. At some point, if you're a teacher, most of the students that I play with are studying to be teachers. Uh, at some point, a student is going to cross the line. It's inevitable. And beginning to think about that, what that's going to look like, what that's going to feel like, what you're going to do, um, how that connects to things you may have seen or experienced in your own life. Not just in a professional context, because the teachers have been students and haven't all come from supportive environments. Uh, to know that it matters if there's that one person who looks out for you ends up being a much more complex thing, even if it's a single session play. Uh, the interesting thing I would say about Mantles in the museum is that you're playing a character who normally has a different view than you. So it isn't actually generally about a share out, but it's about perspective taking, about knowledge transfer, about seeing things a little differently. But the homework, where they are reflecting both in their own voice and in the voice of the character, sometimes provides an avenue for seeing how the context matters. Even though those characters are actually fairly simple, every one of them, their background affects the way they see art. They are this kind of framework because of who they are. One of them is a politician who's aware that the arts matter because at the time I wrote it, it was 8% of the state budget, but it's actually 14% now, even though the arts are underfunded within most states. They're actually a significant part of the economy, uh, as opposed to the art dealer who is trying to make someone fall in love with that perfect piece of art.
I'm also imagining that that exercise gives them like that mantle of the expert experience where maybe they feel like they can engage with art in a different way. Do you find
Yep.
that?
Yeah, I mean, that's largely why it's the introductory experience. You can you can play this as a more established person. I've played it with art teachers, uh, but it's meant to be a little bit earlier within someone's experience because it does, like you say, give you the authority. Um, it disrupts the assumption that you don't have a right to say anything. Uh, to slide slightly into art criticism as a process, there's more than one way of doing art criticism. A common one uses a process of describe, analyze, interpret, judge, which can be very useful, but is also, it divides things into these neat spaces to make sense of them, but also to try to remove your own opinion. And I don't find it particularly useful when I'm dealing with first graders because the first grader comes up to something and says, that looks weird. And you're saying, if you start by discounting that and say, let's not start there, let's start by describing what we see. I am describing what I see. What I see something weird. Uh, so starting with the visceral experience, especially with younger students, to me tends to be the better way to go. But the academic approach still tends to favor the idea that there is an objective truth, that the institutionalist view is the right one. And one of the things the game does is challenge that.
Seems so paradoxical, like objective truth and art criticism. Like, but yes, of course,
Yeah,
I've been trained in that too in film studies, right? Like, what is a great film and why?
yeah.
So you mentioned limitations of your games for participants. Could you say what kind of limitations those are and how they support the play experience for your players?
So there, there's a couple of different things that engage with that within kind of game studies talk. When you are limiting time and space, it has a couple of effects. One is that it encourages you to swing for the fences in social play. Uh, a an emotional response is more interesting. And that doesn't necessarily, that's not always limited to the live action immersive games. 500-Year-Old Vampire, whatever they're writing about to each other is one particular instance. It's one thing that hit a prompt. And to write, it's been 30 years and nothing very interesting has happened, is not what someone's going to want to do. So the framing that it provides is actually part of the advantage there. So that's one limitation. You always have the alibi of the character. The fact that it is not you, that it's someone else, is actually technically a limitation. Um, Being bound by the rules. So Mantles in the museum requires those. There were those little boxes on the bottom of the name tag. No, you don't finish in any of the three galleries you're going to until you've talked to every one of those boxes. You need to talk to someone from each framework, and then you use a dry erase marker and you just cross them out. Uh, so that's a timing mechanism, but it also encourages you to seek out different perspectives about the different works of art that are within it. And so that's a mechanical limitation that is also at the same time pushing this kind of conversation. It pushes those moments, those interactions to the forefront. Whereas in real life, we might want to avoid an area where we think we'll be in conflict with someone. Here, you have to, or you are not going to leave that gallery. So,
It's both a limitation and an affordance in a way, which is quite
yeah,
really interesting. So here's a logistical question of how you have you considered publishing these games through social media? And I think we can just say that you have done that, right? Like the Golden Cobra is kind of an example of that, even though it's a website. And
yeah,
then obviously these games are promoted often through Kickstarter or other kinds of like Backer Kit or other kinds of mechanisms. So I would say so much of our field wouldn't exist without social media, actually. Would you agree with that?
I would. I would actually, to go a little bit more into it. At the time when I started, there was the G plus, and
Mm,
every nerd I knew was on G plus.
yeah.
It was, it was, it was great because we didn't share that with anyone else, which is,
Yeah.
but uh, there's a lot of things that have been opened up by the technology of the time that we're living in. I have friends all over the world that I wouldn't have if not for games and if not for social media. I'll also say that, thanks to social media, the magical college came up, right? So New Magiscola, I met a lot of fantastic people. Several of those people helped me survive the pandemic by playing with me online, even though one was in Canada, one was in Texas, one was in Kentucky, and one was in Florida. Uh, the the availability of the technology makes a big difference for us. And it's also why I was able to get feedback early on from scholars that were living in Finland. Um, it's also why I have more people to worry about now in different parts of the world and that I hope are worried about me. Uh, and it's really enlivening. Now, I will say I don't think Facebook's really very good at it. It's got opportunities, it's got things that we're sharing, but it doesn't really encourage connection the way that some other things do. Used to, but in some ways we are still kind of relying on the connections that were made in a different environment, and we're moving through and looking for new tools for creating those connections. Uh, so yeah, they do matter. The way they matter is a constant changing and emergent situation. And also in terms of like broadcasting the games, I have put the what to do about Michaels in my dissertation if you ever want to look it up. Uh, the Mantles in the museum. I should shoot. I meant to put the link in here. I will send you the link later to be shared. It's on Lillian Lewis's website. And then Central Michigan University is selling 500-year-old vampire. But getting attention to these games can be very difficult. One way is things like BackerKit, but even then, it's word of mouth. It's getting it out there. Participating in the various conferences makes a big difference too. So things like Metatopia make a big difference, and introduce you to some fantastic creators.
Yeah, and I mean, we're mentioning a lot of American conventions and conferences here,
Yeah,
but
that's the context I'm in.
yeah, so I mean, just adapt that to your local context, right? Think about what you have in your country and your city, even. You know, oftentimes there are people playing different games within our town that we don't even know about. Making those connections, a lot of it is just showing up and meeting people. Yeah, it's absolutely very important.
I would love to make it to Robocon or Canoodapunk. A little
Well,
difficult given the
I think you
seasons.
should definitely try to make it to Knutpunk next year because we have, I say we, I'm not involved in organizing it, but there is a full arts and LARP conference called Sublime Pretense, and this will be the third year that they're running, and I'm assuming they're running it again next year. Unfortunately, they often cross book it with the EduLARP conference, so we'll see if we can try to figure out how to, but basically we're at a point now where there's so many of us have professionalized that we have like conferences before the conference now. And by the time we get to Knutpunkt, it's like, okay, we can relax a little bit, which is kind of different than in the past. But yes, we have quite a few more questions, but I think we can end with this one. I'm developing my own TTRPG, and I was wondering if you have any best practices for creating meaningful and unique experiences for the players through the game system.
Well, I think my main thing is the iteration of just getting it out there and having students play it, or people rather, um, because it can be hard to, as a game designer, sometimes we want to try and anticipate everything. We want to try and build everything. We want to have all the nuts and bolts in places, and we want to have everything ready to go because we want to present this perfect experience. So first of all, accept that doesn't exist. Um, it's like saying the perfect community. Communities are defined by both having some kind of point of commonality. That's what makes them a community, but also the areas of difference. The things that define what a community can do is the different people who are involved and what they're bringing to the table, what they've seen, what they know. And that's what a game is when you get down to it. A game is a community, even if it only exists for a very short time in a very small space. So the affordances of the game can encourage certain things, they can discourage them. The tinkering that you do afterward matters. The reason that some of my games have like word banks is because the communities I was working with needed them in order for the game to function. Uh, so you can borrow mechanics, you can adapt things, you can do whatever, but the most important thing is to get it on the table and see if it flies.
I think there's an element of trusting your players in the process too, like which is
Now,
difficult with people who haven't LARPed before.
if you want them to take the risk, you got to take the risk though. Like we're asking people to take a risk. We got to model that.
I think with that, we will say goodbye today. I'm sorry we didn't get to get everybody's questions, but thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Jason, for sharing your wonderful work with us. I think I speak for probably a lot of people here that I can't wait to get to a museum and play this game. Thank you so much. In terms of upcoming events, we don't have anything on the docket yet, except for the Transformative Play Initiative seminar, which will be happening June 12th through 13th, in person and online through Discord. So we will be streaming it. yeah, if you want more information about that, just message us at the Transformative Play Initiative. You can also find the information on our Facebook page. Speaking of Facebook, that is primarily where we live, because that is primarily where LARP lives. But of course, these things are ever changing, as you mentioned. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are in the world.